Hello, today I want to talk about user capability and the differences between users and how we express those to computer systems to allow those systems to adapt accordingly. But before we get into that, a little bit of an introduction about myself. My name's Bob Dodd. I come from an industrial automation background. One of my first projects after I left university was the Cadbury Cream Egg production line in Bourneville in Birmingham in the UK. Then after about 10 years of various systems modelling jobs in the IT industry, I ended up at Nokia Research in Helsinki. And what we were interested in Nokia was adaptive systems. We wanted to be able to have a user interface that could adapt to different physical devices, to different contexts of use. And then suddenly my world changed. My father became ill with cancer. And I ended up stopping my work at Nokia in Helsinki and returning to the UK to help care for him. And in that move to the UK, I still needed to do something to keep my mind going. And I started doing a master's degree in multimedia, which was followed by a PhD investigating self-adapting user interfaces as assistive technology. So I started my PhD looking at the ways that we adapt user interfaces to get a better feeling for what's involved in that adaptation and the kind of information we really need from a user to be able to adapt appropriately. So the image on the right hand side of the screen is sort of towards the end of that particular part of the process. And what you see on screen is an old BlackBerry Torch touchscreen, and it has an adaptive keyboard where you swipe with your finger on the screen with your thumb, and it creates a stripe, and that stripe becomes your keyboard, and therefore wherever you move your finger across that stripe, you can select individual characters. Now the challenge we have with that style of user interface is the precision that's necessary to get all 26 characters and numbers on that little swipe, and that small space where you're moving your thumb maybe is the precision. So how do you make sure that you're choosing the correct character easily? Because obviously if you have mobility issues, you may not be able to be that precise where you're touching the stripe, especially when you can only see what you're touching in that top right hand corner of the screen where you see the user's currently over the letter O. But I have some math and some software behind that to help, and it's called Transparent User Prediction. Transparent User Prediction, or TUP, uses next character prediction based on the last n characters that you've already typed, including punctuation, to try and choose what you're likely to select next. And to help it do that, it uses a British corpus of books, magazines, journal articles to identify the most likely next character based on that huge block of English text. The test platform for this was an Apple iPod Classic, which dates us to around about early 2000. And the iPod, one option that they had for the iPod was called PodWrite, which used TUP, but you can see you had this tiny little screen where you had the entire alphabet round and you had to tap to touch the individual character, and TUP helped you work out whether you were touching the right spot on the screen for those small characters. Of course, the first problem that you hit is that tiny little screen, and you're drawing a circle with all of the alphabet on it, plus all the punctuation, plus all numbers. And that's really, really small. Trying to do that with somebody with low vision, you have to rethink the idea a little bit. And my implementation for the iPod took away the alphabet on the screen and replaced it with the circle. So the circle represents where you're touching on the wheel. So the image on the right shows a finger down over the letter O. So in this case, the screen is showing where your finger is. TUP is choosing what character it is for you. So we can take away the small alphabet and provide something that's more legible. But there are still other issues, certainly when working with an iPod, in terms of people with mobility issues. For example, people with MS, where people have hand tremors, knowing what button, where you're pressing on that scroll wheel is a bit of a challenge, because if you have hand tremors and you don't have much of a sense of touch, you don't know how hard you're touching the screen and your finger kind of bounces around. So is it where you first touch the screen that matters, or is it where your finger ends up? And very quickly it becomes a question of what you're capable of doing as a user. Can you touch a point and stay at that point? Is it when you touch a screen, you have to allow your finger to move around to get to the right place before you release? Are you able to touch and hold an individual spot? Because that's going to affect the algorithm in terms of selecting whether you're touching that screen and whether you're clicking at a point below it. So the whole model of TUP says, well, I need to know a lot. Again, I need to know what you can do. I'm not interested in your disabilities that you've got MS. I need to know whether you can touch the screen precisely. I need to know how long you can hold that button there. I need to know what you prefer in terms of landing zone, if you like, for your finger on a button. So it becomes very much a model of your capabilities as a user in terms of how you can use the device at that particular time. And that's a little bit different to the sort of medical model that you might think of in terms of disability, in terms of saying, well, someone who's got MS and they can have blurred vision, they can have hand tremors, they can have kinesthetic problems where they don't know quite where they're placing their fingers. All of that's true. None of that helps me build TUP. For TUP, I need to know what you can actually do so I can build an algorithm that's going to work for you. And that's kind of where my research moved off into. And it's also a little bit different to the way we generally think about accessibility settings on a computer. And accessibility settings will be choosing TUP and maybe then choosing configuration of TUP. What we want to know is about the individual user rather than the fact that they're choosing TUP. If they choose TUP, then that model of capability comes in. If they choose a different form of input, the same model of capability is still having to know how you can use a keyboard. However you do text input onto a device, your model of human capability is the same. You shouldn't be having to configure each individual device based on the needs of that particular algorithm. The algorithm should come and work it out from you rather than you having to configure for the algorithm. Now, TUP is an input modality, and it's easy to see the relationship between human capability and the modality in terms of how you're going to configure it, how you're going to pick the state models that work behind it. What about the more general case? What about simple applications, simple games even? So with that, let's try stepping back 36 years to Tetris. It's interesting in terms of accessibility. It's something that is very well known. It's relatively simple to understand. It's visually rich. It's very timing dependent, but it has simple controls. However, if you're wanting to play the game whilst blind, certainly with every single feature, it's an extremely challenging game to play. So how difficult? Well, there are 7 pieces, and each piece has 4 different positions as they rotate on the screen. And when they land at the bottom of the screen, they start to build the silhouette. And the user needs to understand the rotation of the piece that's falling. They need to understand the silhouette. They have to work out where the optimal position is on that silhouette at the bottom. So looking more specifically at that required player capability, what do you need from a user? They need to be able to recognize 7 basic shapes. They need to be able to follow movement of one shape as it's progressing down that playing area, whilst assessing its landing area at the bottom of the playing area, so in that silhouette that I was talking about. It needs to match the outline of the moving shape to those gaps in the silhouette at the bottom of the playing area, and it needs to optimize the matching to fill horizontal lines in order to score points and win the game. More than that, it needs to optimize the matching to take account not only of the current piece that's falling, but the next piece. So you know about the next piece that's going to land before you reach the bottom. You also need to optimize the match to take account of how some shapes can rotate around the corners of obstacles. So the T-piece, for example, does weird things at the edge of the screen. So given that, how would you present the game to the user? For example, how would we present this complex game to a person with vision loss, to a person with hearing loss, to a person with limited mobility, to a person who's neurodivergent, or any combination of the above, because people don't just have one disability? So it's starting to look like we need to know an awful lot about the capabilities of a user to maximize all of their capabilities in terms of user interaction, to handle all those complex interactions that are going to occur. And maybe we need to start thinking about how many of those do people have to understand at any one time. What are the concurrent elements that are in this particular game? Well, quite a few actually. There's the current tile and its relationship to the playing area, the previous tiles that are still visible, and there's the current silhouette at the bottom of the screen. There's the shape of the next tile, the shape of the held tile, if any, the current game level, the number of lines, and the historic high scores. So there's a lot of things, not necessarily all at the same priority level. So there's clearly going to be some things that you need to know immediately, and there's other things that are there if you want to go and find them out. So there's different priorities of concurrent information in these games. And in terms of choosing what information to provide to the user, we're going to have to choose what's the most effective way to represent each of them. So let's think about the interaction concepts that we might try and use to represent those concurrent information. And choosing a few at random, we have things like the cockpit and the heads-up display, whether we have an immersive or an observational environment, where we have sprite-based animation where things are moving around on the screen that have meaning, whether we're on a canvas-based environment or a sort of grid 2D or 3D playing area, and Tetris is a bit sort of 2D grid. Then a concept like gravity and history, and if we think about the silhouette at the bottom of the screen, that's history. And then things like elapsed time and how that's going to be represented as well. Now, if we can choose which interaction concepts are being applied to different concurrent information that we need to supply to the user, we can then think about what user capabilities are necessary to express those particular interaction concepts. So let's look a little bit more detail at sprites. So I apologise for the death by PowerPoint here. We'll just spin through this as quickly as we can. There's so many different types of sprite that you have to think about in terms of how they're going to interact with the user and the user's capabilities. So very briefly, we have sort of game influence sprites, this sort of flying aliens that we have in Space Invaders, or the folding tiles we have in Tetris. There's user influence sprites, that's the ones that's a user controlled gun in Space Invaders, for example, where you're moving things around. In Tetris, it's that falling tile that's the user influence sprite. There are also sprite influenced sprites, so flying aliens that get destroyed on contact with missiles, for example. There's also time-limited sprites. The missiles in Space Invaders is an obvious example, but our silhouette in Tetris essentially is a time-limited sprite that keeps sliding further and further down the page as the game progresses, and so on. So there are another bunch that I've actually got up on screen here, but the point is there are a lot of different types of sprite. Each sprite, we have to find a way to express to the user that behavior, and to look at how the user interacts with those individual sprites, what capabilities do they need to perceive it in its position and to manipulate it. What's interesting though is things are becoming much more abstract now, because whether it's a game influenced sprite that's in Space Invaders or Tetris, it's still a game influenced sprite. A user influenced sprite is still a user influenced sprite whichever game it's in. So it looks like there are a set of metaphors around games in the same way as the sort of metaphors around books and pages in HTML. And if we can work out what these general metaphors are, we can think about what interaction modalities that we can design and build in an adaptive way that matches user capability. And that kind of brings us back to the modalities in the likes of TUP, where we're trying to configure a modality to match user capability. So the kind of descriptions of interactions that we have for TUP is kind of what we need for all the sprites, and for all the other interactions that the user has inside games, inside spreadsheets, inside databases. I guess we're so used to HTML and its forms and its headings, we don't really think about the modalities that are there. But there can be many other ways to adapt a user interface than just the interaction metaphors we're used to in HTML, as we've seen with Tetris here. So having considered that interface, Let's now start thinking about the users and how we describe the users to allow that interface to adapt. Now, there's a standard definition to describe users and their capabilities. It's called Access for All, and it's actually an international standard, ISO 24751. Now, Access for All is trying to describe user needs and preferences, particularly in an educational setting. And it builds on the IMS Global Learning Consortium's Access for All metadata specification, and it describes information in an XML notation in a portable way. And we'll see an example of that XML in a moment. But the XML formatted user profile is expected to be generated by a software tool. It's not something you would expect to write by hand. The whole idea was you'd always have a nice user interface where you can come along, interview a user, populate the information, press go, and it produces this user profile that can then be machine read. But let's have a look at what that machine read data is, because it's not too hard to read. So the screen is showing now a very simple fragment of Access for All. I've deleted some content just to try and keep it simple, make it fit on a single page of PowerPoint. So we're going to be talking about display preferences for the user, and specifically we're going to be looking at screen readers. And there are two entries under screen reader, one for screen reader generic and one that says application name JAWS. And the idea here is that if you hit any general screen reader, then we can decide what the speech rate should be, for example. Then there are detailed specifications for JAWS itself, for the particular properties of JAWS for its setup. So all of those application specific things within that particular screen reader. So if you also used VoiceOver, there'd be another one that said application name equals VoiceOver, and then you get all the VoiceOver settings inside here. So it's very setting related. It's that accessibility model that you have on PCs and browsers now, where you say, I'm going to go to accessibility and I want a screen reader and I want this speech rate and I want to use this voice. It's that style of configuration information that's going into Access for All. So that's a description of a display. Let's have a look at a description of a control. So this time the XML is showing controls for keyboard, and so the keyboard enhanced, and then it's keyboard enhanced generic, just the same we had for the screen reader. That's saying whether you want to use sticky keys and whether you want to play sounds on key presses. This time, however, we're not showing any applications or anything special. We've just got general keyboard requirements. But there can be application specific information. If we go back to a thumb pad that we talked about earlier with TUP, it can have its own settings as well. It can have the keyboard thumb pad where it has a landing zone to say, well, it's the first touch that counts. There could be auto repeat value to say, well, we actually don't want auto repeat because we can't keep the finger on the key, and there could be other issues in there as well. So we can certainly define the thumb pad modality in terms of Access for All. That fits neatly inside that particular model. Of course, you could end up with multiple repeated sets of content depending on all of the different types of user interface that the user may come up to, different types of keyboard, whether it's the thumb pad, whether it's a regular keyboard, whether it's a swipe keyboard, whether it's a handwriting recognition style of keyboard input. So you would end up with the same user properties being applied time and time again, defined in a way that works only for that particular individual application. And every time a new modality comes up, you have to go and redefine everybody's profile to deal with that particular set of settings as well. This is always the weakness of Access for All, because it's that configuration settings model that's so specific to particular versions of particular applications that every time you get a new version of JAWS, there's new settings. Every time you get a new version of VoiceOver, there's new settings, and Access for All has to update to take that into account. And that's awkward and difficult because the user has to go back to the program that generates the XML. So it's not a comfortable way for people to use a system outside of a strongly controlled academic environment, which is what Access for All is designed for. So let's see what happens though if we try and apply access for all to something like Tetris. So this time the XML is showing a control block for keyboard again, but specifically for Tetris. So it's talking about the move left, the move right key, the describe and exit key, for example. So within Tetris, within a specific version of Tetris, you could build an access for all model that says that for this particular user they need to use a keyboard and we need those particular keys to work for the user in that environment. It doesn't help a great deal in describing more complex modalities because it was just going to expand and expand, and display is just going to get very complex, and every single application would have to have those settings for the users that are going to use that particular application. So again, every time you find a new game like Tetris or a new spreadsheet or a new word processor, you then have to go back and get a new set of settings for access for all to be able to take around as your generic model. And this is just going to grow and grow, whilst your own personal capabilities as a human being haven't changed one jot. So there really are limitations for this sort of model. And that's what my own academic research was about. One part was about trying to model the application itself, whether it be Tetris or a word processor or a spreadsheet or just a simple form on a website. And I was looking to describe that in a way that we could apply user profiles to change individual elements of that. A model of how we can navigate through that semantic information, and finally a model of how we can adapt that content to match user capability. So when it comes to adaptation, we have to kind of decide what we're adapting. Are we adapting the system to a specific user capability set? Or are we adapting to an environment or a particular circumstance of operation? Are we adapting so that a number of people can share the same user interface because they're doing a group project at school, they're maybe watching movies at home, and they all want to have access to the same user interface, and you need to somehow come up with a model that merges different user capabilities to find something that will work for everyone. In terms of my work, I would talk about polymorphic profiles there, where Fred is like Jim except for these particular changes. Because that's really what we're doing with sort of templating, where you say, well, we have a standard system, but we need to change how the keyboard's working because of mobility issues. We need to change audio because the user doesn't have a very good response in the high frequency range. We need to change the response because they don't have very good hearing in the left ear. And you don't want to have to describe the entire user. You just want to say what the difference is in terms of capabilities, in terms of what you can hear, what you can touch, how long you can do something. So that said, let's consider a more concrete example. Because whilst the concepts might sound complicated, the reality is much simpler. Let's think about vision for a moment. How would you describe a person in terms of their vision and their capabilities with the vision? So we have a simple table here. We have 4 columns. We've got a property name, the values that property can take, the parent, which I'll come to in a moment, and a description of the property. So if we take the property name vision, it can have 3 values. It can be full, partial, or none. It has no parent because it's the top of the tree of knowledge about vision. And the remaining properties will only be of interest really for partial sight, because if you have full vision, you don't need any other information. If they only have partial sight, you need to know a lot more about the user. So we want to know, for example, do users have stereo vision? And again, if the property is stereo, then the values are full, partial, and none. We're also interested in whether people can focus on a point. So the third property is focus. which again has full, partial,
So it created
none
an abstract
options.
model of any application.
And the description
that
in this
began
case says, can the
looking
user
at
focus
the
on
individual
a point? Elements partial
within
would
that
suggest
application,
blurred or
the
double
text,
vision.
the images, the
An example
video,
of none would be a user
and
who
then
could
built
distinguish
up
light and
a
dark,
semantic
but
model
not
of how
images.
that information related
The
to each
next
other.
property says focus duration, and that has a value that's time in minutes, and it has a parent of focus, so only if focus is partial or full are we interested in focus duration. And then focus duration is defined as the length of time a user can continue to focus on a point, not necessarily the same point, before experiencing fatigue. This one comes back to people with MS again, where the double and blurred vision, their mobility issues in terms of trying to control their hand tremors, and just general fatigue through MS means they can only concentrate for a little while, and then it becomes just too tiring and difficult for them. So they can look at something for a little while but not for very long. The next property on the list says tracking, and again it has settings of full, partial and none. It's also a child of focus, so it's when we're looking at people who can focus either fully or partially on a particular item. In the case of tracking, it says, can the user visually track a moving item? So if you spot something and see it move across the screen, that's a measure of tracking. So it's trying to get the skills the user has based on their capabilities. It's not trying to measure colour blindness. It's not trying to measure any specific attribute of the eye. It's simply what the user can actually do. And that's what the user can do, including whatever compensation strategies they apply to a situation. Now, of course, what we can do with describing vision, we can also do to describe hearing and tactile as well. So let's have a quick look at those. So this time the table is of hearing. So we still have 4 columns of property name, values, parent and description, but now hearing is our top level property for the tree of knowledge of hearing. And we have 4 example properties beneath hearing. The first is stereo, which is hopefully obvious. That is, we need to know whether someone has stereo hearing, to know whether we can use panning of audio, whether we can use 3D sound. The second property is hearing band. Not everybody can hear as well in either ear, and there can be sometimes the whole registers of the frequency ranges are just missing for people. In fact, as people get older, you find that men particularly tend to lose their lower register. The third property is point source discrimination. And again, we need that because we need to know whether someone in a 3D world knows where sound is coming from. Can they tell that the sound is in front or behind or to one side? The fourth property is cocktail party. Cocktail party effect is the ability to listen to a single conversation amongst many conversations around you, and you can focus in on one person and listen to that one person. And that's not a skill that everyone has. It's the one that I have problems with. If I'm in a noisy room, I have great difficulty understanding the conversation, even of the person that's standing directly in front of me, if there's lots of people talking around. So again, it's something that you need to know, especially if you're building up a large, complex soundscape in a game. You need to know what sounds you can use, how many sounds, how many people can be speaking even at a distance. So cocktail party is actually an important property. Now, very quickly, we switch over to haptic, just to give you a feeling for haptic. I've listed 4 potential properties for haptic. Talk about tactile touch. In other words, can you sense touching a surface at all? There's tactile press. Can you sense pressing down on a surface? Then there's touch time, which is the maximum length of time that a surface can be reliably touched. If you press and hold, will your finger actually stay down? Because people with mobility issues, particularly people who have hand tremors, struggle to hold their fingers directly on a button. Then finally I have multi-touch. Multi-touch describes the number of points on a surface that can be reliably touched at the same time. and again depending on your mobility. So we've been able to describe some properties of the user. How do we go about using those in a game like Tetris? We talked about Tetris, we talked about all of the different elements within the game, the concurrent parts that are needed, all of the information that needs to be expressed to the user. How do we then build a user interface based on the properties that we have here to build an interactive, inclusive game? And the answer is we have to start looking at the sort of interaction metaphors or modalities that are available for each of those different elements of the game. First, there's the aside. Literally, we're talking about an aside here, where a voice whispers information into a user's ear. So if you think about Tetris, that could be someone whispering what the next tile is. So it's an easy way to drop information. So it's not designed to be front and center. It's just additional information that's being passed to you. Another audio metaphor that we could potentially use for people with low vision is a talking scroll bar. With the talking scroll bar, audio plays out from left to right, starting at the extreme left of your hearing and ending at the extreme right. And the relative position of the sound gives the position within the playout. So in Tetris, for example, that could be the relative vertical position of a falling tile. So you imagine that as the tile drops down the screen, you have a sound that represents the position. So as the audio for the game is progressing, it moves from left to right as the tile reaches the bottom and joins the silhouette. So you can tell from the position of the sound where your tile is, whilst you're doing other things with the game. And finally, let's talk about musical sonar. One of the big challenges in Tetris, in terms of low vision, is trying to deal with that silhouette, that landscape at the bottom of the playing area, which is ragged, it's random, it depends how the tiles have previously landed, depending on what you've been doing. But you need to know the structure and the layout of that landscape really quite accurately, because it affects your ability to score points and win the game. And what musical sonar does in terms of an audio metaphor is a sort of musical interpretation of sonar. And again, the music plays out as the audio pans from left to right. And this time the notes that are played represent the information that's relative to that position in the audio pan. So you could have a note that's going up and down relative to where you are, to say, oh, you're coming to a tall piece and then you're dropping back down and now you're going back up. And now it's level for a little while and up again. So that the position as you go from left to right is describing a graph. So you're getting an audio tonal map of that ragged surface at the bottom. So the user has a better understanding of where the pieces can fall. Now, taking musical sonar, how does that kind of map back into capabilities? Well, if you remember the hearing properties we had stereo, hearing band, point source discrimination, and cocktail party. Well, musical sonar is panning from left to right, so we definitely need to know whether people have stereo hearing, because if we don't have stereo hearing, that whole 3D panning is never going to work. You also need to be able to spot point source discrimination, because you have to understand that that particular point of sound is the same point of sound moving from left to right. So you can't just have it generally that sounds are left and right. You have to be able to pick it out relatively well. Otherwise, the resolution of the panning is going to be really poor. Then, of course, we're playing identifiable sounds. Therefore, the hearing bands that the user has is going to come in there, because we need to know whether we're going to be an upper register, lower register, whether you can hear just one ear or both ears. So that's going to affect the kind of sounds that you can use in musical sonar. So there is a mapping of capabilities into these metaphors, and that's what you need for each of the metaphors. So you need an awful lot of metaphors to describe behaviors in different environments. You need a set of interaction metaphors that work for vision, a set that work for hearing, a vision that work for haptic and tactile. And the larger that set of metaphors, the more adaptive and inclusive the environment can be. But for each of those metaphors, we then have to go through and work out which properties out of the capability set are important for those particular metaphors, so that the system can choose an appropriate metaphor based on user capability, based on the needs of the application. So pulling it together, we've kind of talked about two sides of the same coin. I talked about modeling the application itself and describing it in terms of its semantics, of its navigation, and of ways to adapt that interface. And that adaptation comes from the choice of the metaphors we were just talking about. And what drives that adaptation is the capability models that we were looking at. So for example, at the moment I have the hearing properties on the right hand side of the screen, where we had stereo, hearing band, point source discrimination, and cocktail party. And then we need to map these properties onto the metaphors that we had earlier. So we have a mapping of a game to the metaphors that are appropriate to that particular game. And then we have a mapping between metaphors and the properties of the user. So a game has to select out of all of those metaphors which ones are appropriate to the game. And out of those metaphors, you then have to select the ones where the capabilities match the user. So there's a sort of double level of filtering. But where does that mapping happen? It happens in the runtime system. Now, I was chiefly talking about my system model, which goes from external content through inventory, semantics, navigation, and adaptation. I said the adaptation layer describes how we can change the individual layers. The system that does that is the runtime system, which is the box to the right hand side of those layers. And that runtime system is the dynamic part of our content-driven modality selection. So that's a way of saying we describe the content and behavior of a game or application independent of implementation. We describe appropriate metaphors and modalities of each part of that content and its interaction. We describe the capabilities of users using the capability model. And we describe each metaphor and modality in terms of the needed capabilities. Then the runtime system takes each of those sections, each of those mappings, to build the user interface that we have, and that we love and know as Tetris, but in a form that works for each user that comes to play the game. Now, there's a lot of things we've skipped over here. Obviously, there are many different modalities, many different metaphors, and they may all be competing for the same design space. So inside audio, there may be many things trying to compete for 3D audio, many things trying to compete to use panning, for example. So something has to make sense of which metaphors work together. So there's a lot of things inside the runtime system that I simply don't have time today to go through. It is more than a talk on its own. But hopefully with what you've seen, you get an idea for why it's necessary to describe users in terms of their capabilities, rather just in terms of accessibility preferences like we have now, where we say, oh, well, my user likes to use a screen reader and they need these particular screen reader settings for this particular application of JAWS. And we have to get into the actual capabilities of the user, because yes, it's good to define how we want to use a screen reader, but that doesn't help a user interface configure a widget to work with a user, regardless of what assistive technology they have. And that can only come out of the modeling of human capabilities. So having said that, thank you very much for listening. Any questions?